It's TV week, and what I thought I would do in this edition of 90s and Noughties UK is share with you my memories of growing up watching CITV in the late 90s and early 2000s, because I'm sure for many people of my age group living in the UK at the time, getting home from school and watching either the two strands that were on, so CBBC or CITV, or maybe even something on Sky, was a hugely important part of your day. Which one did you watch? Were you lucky enough to have Sky, so like Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, or did you watch one of the terrestrial offerings? CITV on ITV like myself, or CBBC on BBC One? Now, I should mention that I don't have too many memories of that, simply because I was watching the other side. The only things I remember are as follows. Looking up Bill and Ben when they returned in the early 2000s, just because I was kind of intrigued from a historical point of view. It always intrigued me when they brought things back and what would it be like. I also remember watching some of the art programs they had, like Smart, for example, as well as a show where they used to play Tom and Jerry cartoons in the middle, plus Otis the Aardvark, obviously. CBBC was the place where they had weird mascots who talked to people, whether it was Ed the Duck in the early 90s, Gordon the Gopher, right up to Otis the Aardvark. And I think there was a variant on Nickelodeon called CBBC on Nickelodeon, where you had Otis's cousin called Marvin. And I think it was the same actor, but just doing a different character. Those are really the only memories. Oh, and Okie Doke. I mean, who doesn't remember Okie Doke? That's like one of my earliest memories, period. But for me, CITV was the place to be at like 3:15, or in my case, it was more like 3:30 to 4 o'clock, because that's when I'd get in from school. That was the place to be. And my earliest memories of CITV are just before they went in Vision. So when it was Steve Ride doing the voiceover, and they'd introduced something like Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries, or the program in which I remember perhaps being the earliest, which was Funhouse with Pat Sharp. And that image of him coming in on a go-kart. I mean, everyone wanted to go on the go-kart and Funhouse is like embedded into my memory, and you just don't forget it. But really, those early days of CITV for me were good because I loved the programming that was on it. But when they went in Vision around 97, 98, that is when it really kicked off. So not only was I able to tune into one of my favourite shows at the time, which was Bimble's Bucket, if you remember that. I think it was produced by one of the regions when regional television was just about still a thing. I could also make new friends via the television. They had two presenters who did it most of the time. They were Stephen Mulhern and Danielle Nichols. And I remember them so vividly because they were just fun, right? They were young, they were fun, and there was so much technology. I mean, it was really the age where they were experimenting with all kinds of things. So you'd go from one scale to the other. Let me give an example. So they'd be doing a link, and what you would see is Danielle stood next to a cardboard cutout of Walter Mellon. And then they'd introduce the program. And then during the credits of that program, they'd be in front of a green screen. So they'd just appear in front of the credits. And this was like space age. And the thing is, I was like 8 or 9 years old. This is an incredible thing to see. And it just made it fun, as well as those logos, obviously, with the aeroplane that came in and that little tune that came in. It just made it fun for me. And I really developed a connection between them and myself. Like, this is the days before Twitter, before you could tweet your heroes. And for me, just being able to tune in and know they were there, like, that was a really powerful thing. And yeah, the days before Twitter, that's what you had and you were happy with it. And I remember watching once and writing a letter to them. I don't know whether we sent it or not, but I wanted to be on CITV. And we looked up where it was, and it was quite a long drive, long journey, you know. I don't think we sent it, but I did some drawings. And like I say, I felt such a connection because they used to do that drawing thing, didn't they? Where they'd show people's drawings, and that's what I was going in for. But I digress. I digress. For me, growing up, Stephen and Danielle were heroes of mine. I also particularly enjoyed the more factual side of programming. So you had like the comedy stuff, you had a few imports, they had Looney Tunes and Slimpig. Anyone remember Slimpig, or is it just me? That theme tune, which was like da 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 Slimpig, or whatever it was. Very odd moment in time. But for me, shows like How To and The Big Bang, both of them with Gareth Jones, and How, obviously, with Fred Dinenage, who I got to interview on this podcast. And for me, at one point, I was living hundreds of miles away from where I grew up. And Fred was the newsreader for where I grew up. So when I was living hundreds of miles away, the only way I could see what I saw as a piece of home was to watch How To. It's Fred Dinenage, because obviously he didn't come on the new local news, you know, where I lived then. And so coming back and seeing he was still on there, amazing. You know, it was always a piece of home. And so I developed this connection to Fred because of that, and obviously to Gareth as well, because of the knowledge thing. I loved the kind of facts that he'd come out with. The era of the Big Bang, when he was presenting with his wife Violet Berlin, were just incredible. Amazing mix of science and fun. I remember going to school and wanting to do one of the things that they did on there. I think it was the tracing paper ironing trick. I wanted to do that. I never did. Maybe it's time I did that on something. There we are, inspiring me all these years later. But you see, in those days, you did have this connection to the people that you saw on screen. How many people woke up on a Saturday morning and switched on Ant, Dec and Cat for SMTV Live and felt like they were just some of your mates who've dropped in? I think they were the first show. It was the first show I remember watching at the turn of the millennium. And so I looked up the clip recently and I was like, I feel like I saw this on broadcast, which is very odd. But programming on CITV back in the day, you had your cartoons, like I say, you had some of your imports and bits and pieces. But for me, the real magic, along with those things, you know, with the in-vision continuity, was the live action stuff. Things like Mike Angelo, with first Tyler Butterworth and then Tim Whitnell later. A magical thing, because an alien living in your attic or whatever it was, the vision of him walking up the wall, I don't think anyone can kind of forget that. You know, that's an amazing thing. I've got here on my notes BW, and I'm going to assume that's Bernard's Watch. Anyone remember Bernard's Watch? I remember sitting in a after school club looking at the internet in the early days of the internet, And I was looking at the schedule for CITV, and it said Bernard's Watch was going to be on when I got home. And I remember how excited I was as I got onto the bus and got off. And I think I went in and switched on Bernard's Watch, and there it was. Great stuff. And yeah, okay, maybe I just wanted to fantasize about the watch, but if you go back and watch it, you do get engrossed in the characters and the stories, and I do like the kind of underplayed nature of it, the understated thing about it, and I think that was the beauty of it. I don't think you really could make a show like that now. When they brought it back, about maybe 5 or 6 years later in the early 2000s, it just didn't have that magic about it. It wasn't innocent anymore. It was kind of just, it was a bit mischievous and cheeky, and that's not what I wanted from Bernard's Watch. But then by the early 2000s, I think I was much too old for this. And this is the thing. I think for me, the peak era of CITV is between 97 and 2001. I remember when the But Ugly Martians came out, and I remember how blown away I was by the visuals. You go back now and it looks like utter rubbish, but then it was like, wow, what is this show? I need to see more of this. Because it's what we had then. This subject brings up so many memories for me. And like I say, by the early 2000s, I was almost growing away from it. And the budget dropped out of it anyway, because for me, it all went downhill almost after My Parents Are Aliens. That is a show they repeated for much too long. It was into the early 2010s, I think, when it was still on television. And you're like, but this looks ancient by now. All the things that they made over a long period of time, and this is the thing that they choose. I mean, to be fair, around the same time that came out, other shows like Wilmot and Big Meg, Little Meg came out, and they repeated those in the early to mid 2000s on ITV1, I think. And they just looked ancient even by then. I remember watching Wilmot thinking, what is this? Is this from 1997 or from 1987? Because the period in the late 90s to early 2000s is a weird period. By the end of that decade, the end of the 2000s, you're getting a completely different mindset. So anything from like 5 or 6 years before just looks really old. Never mind 10 or 15, because it's still within kind of memorable distance, I guess. But time moves on really quickly. And so CITV eventually lost its funding, and now, unfortunately, after so long, the channel is about to be shut down. And I think that's a real shame. But the moment that they decided not to have in-vision continuity again, I think it's the moment it was time to let it go. Because for me, that was the golden era when you had in-vision continuity and they were being adventurous with bits and pieces and they tried different things and it was a bit silly. I remember a period when they had live performances in the studio. Wow, that was impressive. How many performances of Girlfriend did Billie Piper do? And that is a question to anyone who remembers, or even the people who worked on it who might happen to be listening. Thank you, by the way. It's an honor if anybody from there is listening, because they helped me in the darkest of times. It's really hard when you're a child, and to have friends like that, that you can drop into and they can introduce you to a new show, a new show that you didn't know existed. And certainly, I don't know about anyone else, a lot of these memories are really vivid because I taped them off the TV and I watched them 10 times. So we're of that era where you're taping it so many, and then watching it back. Wow. I'm going to have to get off of this subject and move on because I think I could just talk here all day just by myself. But thank you so much for listening. And please do tell me your memories of growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s. Were you a CBBC kid or CITV? Do let me know. And if you were a CBBC kid, did you watch Neighbours afterwards? Because that's one of the only things I remember. Neighbours was on after CBBC, and I want to say there was a moment in the mid-90s when Home and Away was on ITV after the children's programmes. If I've misremembered that, please correct me. Thank you so much for listening. Rate, comment, and subscribe. Bye-bye for now.